The Stolen Generations is a term used to describe a dark and traumatic chapter in the history of Australia, particularly during the 20th century. It refers to the forced removal of Indigenous Australian children, particularly those of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent, from their families and communities by the Australian government and various state authorities. This policy was implemented with the intention of assimilating Indigenous children into mainstream European Australian society. It began in the late 19th century and continued through much of the 20th century, with varying degrees of government involvement and enforcement in different states and territories. Reasons for removal. Indigenous children were removed from their families for various reasons, including the belief that their Indigenous cultures were inferior and that they would have better opportunities if raised in white Australian households. Some children were taken due to concerns about their welfare, but often this was used as a pretext for forced removal. Impact on families. The forced removal of children caused immense trauma and heartache for Indigenous families. Parents and communities were often left in the dark about the whereabouts and well-being of their children. Many families were torn apart, and Indigenous cultures and languages suffered as conditions of removal. Children who were part of the Stolen Generations were often placed in institutions, foster homes, or adopted by non-Indigenous families. They were often subjected to harsh assimilation policies that aimed to erase their Indigenous identity, culture, and languages. The government implemented a range of policies under the banners of protection and assimilation. These policies included the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families and communities. The rationale behind these policies was that by removing Indigenous children from their cultural and familial contexts, they could be assimilated into European Australian society and civilized. Different states and territories had their own laws and regulations that facilitated the removal of Indigenous children. These laws often gave authorities sweeping powers to remove children from their families, often without any legal due process or parental consent.
I originally come from the Halls Creek area in the Kimberley. My tribe is the Gidja people. My skin is Jawandi. My mother was taken away when she was 3 years old. The Stolen Generation movement, of course. And she was taken to Broome, where I've grown up all my life, and she's never really reconnected to family, and never really reconnected to her mother. And so those policies that affected her affected me, and it will continue to affect my children as well. My connection and association with Stolen Generation movement goes back to my mother and to a lot of the women who I grew up with in Broome at the Holy Child Orphanage and Beagle Bay, where there was a common bond between all Stolen Generation people, and that common bond found themselves as sisters and brothers to each other. And despite their jovial and happy persona, you can see in their eyes they still hurt, and they feel pain for what happened in terms of the policies that affected the change in their life, but also affected their families and their connection to country. And so they lost language and culture and identity, and a lot of them never reconnected. And so I'm passionate about playing my part as a descendant of Stolen Generation in trying to help my elderly people reconcile just a little bit of their pain and their hurt, and play a role in reconnecting them to country. For us to live together as a community, as a whole, as Australians, we need to reconcile that history, and that history is owning it, and not feel ashamed of that history. It's a negative history. The fact is, it's a negative history, and our people were classified as flora and fauna. Our people were massacred, murdered and raped, and we can't change that history. But that history does not belong to Aboriginal people. It belongs to every Australian. The moment you are a new Australian and you become an Australian citizen, that history belongs to you as well. So you can't remove yourself from the history, because this country was built on the suffering of Aboriginal people, and it still is today. We tend to sideswipe our Aboriginal history for some reason, and we have to own that to become one solid nation. For us to really be united, we need to claim that negative history and make ourselves strong as a country. And by making ourselves strong as a country, we make ourselves a great nation.
National apology. In 2008, the Australian government issued a formal apology to the Stolen Generations, acknowledging the pain and suffering caused by the policy. This historic apology marked a significant step toward reconciliation and provided a platform for addressing the ongoing effects of the Stolen Generations. Calls for truth-telling and reconciliation have the lasting effects of the Stolen Generations on Indigenous communities in Australia have been profound and continue to shape their social, cultural, and psychological well-being. These effects also play a crucial role in the ongoing reconciliation efforts in the country. Here are some of the key aspects of the lasting impact and reconciliation efforts. Intergenerational trauma. The forced removal of Indigenous children from their families resulted in deep and enduring trauma. Many survivors and their descendants continue to experience the psychological and emotional scars of this traumatic experience. This trauma has been passed down through generations, contributing to mental health issues, substance abuse, and social challenges within Indigenous communities. Education and employment disparities. The Stolen Generations experience has contributed to disparities in education, employment, and socioeconomic status among Indigenous Australians. Many survivors and their descendants faced limited access to quality education and employment opportunities, perpetuating cycles of disadvantage.